Super. So we're going to open to the public for question. I have only a few as icebreaker to start. So in reaction to your very nice testimony, I was struck by a comment you made about Uniprot, about it was research money and not infrastructure money. And it brings me to the road and bridges problem of open science. So like there are people who are working on infrastructure, and open science is strongly dependent on this infrastructure. And when I was introducing behind open science, there's open source and so on, there's like the sharing economy that is also a big thing that will evolve on the side of open science. Like for instance, with AccuPG, we were influenced by WeShare and how sharing economy could spread new way of doing economy. But we ended up with, we were dreaming of carpooling and couchsurfing with the sharing economy, and we ended up with Uber and Airbnb. How we avoid recapture of those infrastructure by few actors from grassroots movements or from top-down incentive from the system. So it's a big question, because I was very disappointed to see how sharing economy evolved in this recapturing thing, and how we can avoid these dynamics with open science. So
there are a lot of facets. I don't know if you ask now the role of the funding agency or my opinion on the matter now, how to protect. Okay. I think that there is, as you said, there's a huge opportunity to put your data, your ideas online. But I think it's more on, if I have an idea to grow, then I would perhaps look more for crowdfunding if I want to implement myself. If I want to test something, an idea, I would put it. But of course, the risk is always that you will have an aggressive takeover. But I think that's only when an idea matures to something where the business case is really, really attractive. I think most of the scientists don't have, yet such a clear vision. So, so I think for the scientists in the open science, you have to learn new skills, and one new skill would be in relation to new business models, also to get a sense of what your data could provide as a new innovation or a new product. Just putting out your data, it's fine if you want to test it with your community. If it's something you think already it could be to a product, then I would test before I do it. If I understand now your question correctly.
Partially, but what I had in mind is also the way that a lot of people are putting a lot of effort in building databases, infrastructure, and it's like a lot of energy, a lot of funding needed. And the incentive in academia is not necessarily in accordance to this involvement compared to papers.
Okay, so I think in the future, these efforts of scientists to share, to put open sources data, make it available, this I think will become in a reward system. I believe strongly that depending on your research field, if you make things open and the community can profit, that you will incentivize in a way. Not necessarily that everything you put there can be financed, because the budget is limited, and you have to make then a good argument for it, and you will be in high competition with other good ideas. But to incentivize scientists to share data and to make it available, I think, not perhaps the next year, but perhaps in 5 years, that might be really part of the reward incentive system. It's how I conceive it. I think that we go in this direction.
I would add that some of these collection of data are so precious, for science in general at international level, that we should ensure that they are sustainable. I have the example in my field with the human phenomenology. This was developed by Peter Robinson at La Charité in Berlin, and then he was not supported by his institution, which is a disaster when you do that, but he has so much energy and capacity that he developed very well. Now it is the standard worldwide, And he moved to the US fed up with La Charité because of this lack of support. And so no one knows who is responsible for maintaining and developing and updating the data set. Of course, it continues from the US, with US money, but it's a total mess, and that's not for me. It's not acceptable because it's now a common resource with enormous value. A lot of systems use this ontology. Nowadays, so it's a common good. So at a moment, we should acknowledge that when well-established consortium declare that something is a common good and is crucial for a field, we should have mechanisms to support the maintenance, even if the community is contributing and so on, which is the case with HPO, but still you have a minimum of funding to be allocated to that. So for me, it's the solution to that, I think, is because we are in an economy that you described well at the beginning. I think that we should have funding pots provided by both academic funding and by industry, because all these fields are very much, let's say, used by industry to develop products. For instance, HPO is heavily used by people in the sequencing technologies, and you know how much money they make in that field. Okay, so I think they could contribute a bit to maintain HPO. So I think the model of IMI in Europe is a good one. With call for proposals for research infrastructure, with half the money coming from the funding agencies, academic funding, and half from industry.
The European Commission also.
There's already a question.
So well, I'd like to start with by congratulating the speakers for the quality of your talks. That was amazing as an introduction. I had a somehow unrelated question about open data. So the question is as follows. So it struck me that when you look at from a legal perspective, the most of the regulatory constraints are about the use of the data, how you can share, how you can reproduce, authors' rights, stuff like this. But at least to my knowledge, there's nothing about property. So I actually do science for some time now. I don't have the slightest idea who the data belongs to from a legal perspective. And so you could say the data belongs to the participants who actually who measure from. You could say it belongs to the researchers. You could say it belongs to the institution. You could say it belongs to the to the taxpayers. Maybe it's just my ignorance, but I have no idea who it belongs to. So my first question is really, do you have any idea?
No. It's the wording belongs is wrong from a legal point of view. You have intellectual property rights on the data that you produce, but they do not belong to you. You have just intellectual property rights, and you are the custodian of this data, because data are, let's say, precious, and so you have rights, but also duties, and you have to make sure that these data are used properly, for, protected and so on. So, from a legal point of view, you are not the owner; you are just the custodian, and you have some intellectual property rights, but they do not belong to you. For instance, if it is clinical data, they belong to the patient originally. These are up to the society or to whatever, but not to you. No, you are not the belonger.
So if this is not clinical data, who the data belongs to?
But this concept doesn't exist. Something that you buy belong to you, yeah, but you have not bought this. So the concept of belonging does not apply to this field. It's just custodian and IP. Look at the text, legal text on that.
Not necessarily on the legal point, but I think since we produce more and more data, that's why also I mentioned in my presentation specifically one strands of where we're working on the research data management plan is to give also not only train and learn and give a sense of what the responsibility you have with the data, that not then, you know, even if you're not responsible for what others are doing with your data, but at least that you produce reproducible data, because at the end of the day that's a problem nowadays, and life sciences are very high on this on the map of this problem. So not only that you it's reproducible for others, but also that it reaches a certain quality, and that then it can be used in a sensible way. So I think your responsibility as a scientist would be there. That's where I would mark challenge your responsibility.
But also the intellectual property rights that you have is well acknowledged, even in the open science concept. It's normal, for instance, to say that you define an embargo of 6 months or 1 year or 2 years, you know, to be the first one to use your data. What is not acceptable is that you keep them forever, you know, and not use them, because in a work I've done in the field of rare diseases registries, you know, 80% of the data are never used because people just keep that and have no time to exploit the data set. And this is not acceptable. It's against that these concepts have been also developed.
Just to add also on this management of data, something that I don't know if we're going to speak about that today, but the consent of patients, for instance, or participants to the data can be now bring to a more dynamical aspect, so where a patient can in real time say, I agree to share my data for this, not for this, etc. And in the end, for this non-use of data, there's like a lot of changes to make it more dynamical, because you have immense amount of data that are collected for one given research purpose that cannot be used for another research purpose because it has not been put in the consent in the first place. And so it's a big issue, because it's not a question of property, but more of consent and who has the right to do what with those data. It's tricky. There were other questions. I don't keep. Yeah.
Probably we all agree that that the access to rare disease data we have enormous benefits, but where is the balance with the patient's privacy, especially for the rare disease community? What are the standards for the patient's privacy, considering that, for example, for some diseases there are just a few patients in one country with that disease, and of course depending on the country these patients are public knowledge because they appear in the news. So for example, many countries in America, like United States, rare diseases are financed by crowdfunding, philanthropy. So they should appear on the news, showing the face, I have this disease, I don't have money to finance it. So, and then my data is of public access. So what are the standards to keep the safety of the patient? Such as, I don't know, tracking what is being done with the data, or show all kind of applications of the data.
What you describe is totally right, but by the fact that the patients themselves disclose their disease and give a lot of details publicly, show you that this community is consider that the benefits of disclosing this information is more productive than keeping secret their state, because at the end what matters is that people work on their disease and that products develop and so on. So we are always, let's say, balancing between benefit and risk, and in very severe diseases, mainly patients go always for participating to research and sharing their data with other teams in the world. The number of refusals in this community is very, 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 very low. So, but it's specific to situations where people value a lot the benefits of what science can bring, you know, and the progresses which can be made with that. But I agree that they don't often realize all the consequences for them. For instance, especially with insurance, in the US, after that, they are denied to be covered by insurance companies, because they have a very severe diseases. So there are plenty of consequences from that. But for the community, I mean, the rules for rare patients is the same as for common patients. I mean, or for any type of data. I mean, you have to protect data and stick to what you are allowed to do with the consent that you have and with the regulation in place. So there is no specificity, except that the patients want to make public what they have to motivate research teams and to motivate politicians to provide money and so on. So that's a game.
Thank you very much for the presentations and this open discussion. I actually want to follow up on the first question related to Plan S and Science Europe, of course. So I think I agree upon most points of Plan S, and I think it's very important and valuable. But given that half of the people here are students and postdocs, I think our career is, well, an important topic in this discussion. And you already mentioned that within 5 years, making everything open, your data, your analysis, your whatever, will be valued. But how do we need to proceed from now on? Because in a year from now, impact factor is, well, if we cannot publish at Nature, Science and Cell anymore, how can we compete with the States, for example? How can we make sure that the ERC is going to grant us funding if we can only publish in low impact journals at this point?
Okay, I mean, that's a totally fair point. And there were different levels and different aspects. So we start with the last. So the ERC basically endorsed it. So the ERC has now also a commitment to not only judge, it's not the ERC, basically it's the review panels. And the review panels, of course, have now to be briefed and to take other criteria into account. I mean, as I said, it will not be overnight, but that's how it should be done. And that's why I listed the DORA and the Leiden Manifesto, because these are already groups who promoted that. They always said as I said, the journal impact factor can't be everything. Let's say data sharing has to be taken into account, or for the software engineers, they produce the codes, and this has been never taken into account. And I can tell you that for the social and humanities, they never were, I think 70% of their publication are even not listed in a journal impact factor. The age index was never an issue. They have now totally other issue. So yes, because of the Plan S, the whole system basically is in a movement, and you can't leave it like this. And that's why I try to explain that in the next step, Science Europe, or also our members, you have now to see how the reward system is working, and basically you have to adjust it now. How it will work, I don't know. I would lying to you if I would say that I know, because we are now experimenting with changing a system which is 200 years old. But what I mean is that even there are a lot of negotiations either with open access journals. There's also negotiation now with the traditional journals. And of course, there's negotiation worldwide on a global level, because Europe can't, or single countries can't do that, changing a system like this. It has to be collectively. And China, there's discussion with China. China is pretty open. I think you will say something about China. As I said, the Science Academy of South Africa is joining. So it will be a global initiative, and has to, because we can't do it in our own. How it will look like, fair point, I can tell you. What I conceive, or that's why I make my own projection, is that first of all, there will be different value systems for different things. So there will be a value system for research quality. If you would, for example, work towards sustainable development goals, or for a project which has impact on society, there might be different value systems. You would be judged differently. And there has to be a certain nuance thing for different research discipline, because you can't have one indicator for different disciplines. So it's quite complicated, fair point, but the discussion is ongoing. And now you asking me, of course, what you should do, because you still have 5 years to go, and you are, of course, now in the transition phase. Yes, that's yeah. You have to, at the moment, work on both levels. That's my strategy I give you now, just as a scientist. But that's not the Science Europe official statement now. And that's just my statement as a scientist, how I would try to navigate in the transition phase. We are really in a transition phase. But we are also globally, societal in a transition phase with the digitalization. And that's the reality at the moment.
And can I ask why did you choose to start with the end user, the scientist? I mean, Science Europe is this umbrella organization of non-funding, but also all the major funding organizations. So why not start with the funding organization and tell them, like, hey, you need to value open more, like in whatever form? Why start with us, the one that actually, you know, are dependent on these things?
Yeah, I mean, that it's always on the discussion of chicken and egg, because and I understand where you come from. I wouldn't say that. I mean, some funding agencies are certainly more conservative than others, and that's why I said, when you have a system to maintain, you will not disrupt the system. You know, your job is to be conservative, you know, to kind of and guarantee that, you know, funds are flowing. But the point is that funding agency would say, yes, we have to ask the scientist how to do it, because if we do it top down, it will not work either. So the challenge is for you to actually say how it should be done, how you want to be measured. And in fairness, before the science system and the funding agent system and the publication system worked pretty much well in hand, because everybody was accepting the journal impact factor system. So now, basically, you could argue that the funding agencies were pretty bold and you know, kind of go now in a zone out of their comfort zone. But coming back to your question, the best way would be, as a scientist, to say how it should be done and not, you know, accept the journal impact factor. What are other criteria you would like to be judged against and supported? So it's a communication in both sides.
I would add, like, there's a very nice post by Talia Arconi about incentive, and it's called "It's not the incentive, it's you." We say that basically incentive are part of the thing, but if you want to really publish in open access, there are also ways. You can also use preprint, and it's a matter of where you put the cursor as well. I managed to publish all my PhD paper 6 years ago on open access, and I had a position in the end. So it's possible sometimes, but it need not, like, easier. I mean, definitely, especially for funding, I agree. So there are, like, 2 other questions.
That's me. It's related, actually, because I was thinking, listening to you three, that we really need to change all our mentality. So it's a revolution, really, that we are facing. And the critical thing is the evaluation. So it's really a break on the collaboration you mentioned, the fact to move from an individual attitude to collaborative work. Then it has to be rewarded by the evaluation. And if you look at the funding agencies, they don't only look at the impact factor, but also the critical position on your name of the papers. So this is totally counterproductive in terms of collaboration. You don't want to collaborate if you're going to have to argue for who's going to end up at the last author or first author. And most of the time, that's where we stop collaborating, because we really need our students to be in the best position, etc. So one thing that I was surprised, the ANR is part of the whole process, because they really don't have the attitude to open anything, except that this year in the call, it was actually mentioned that we should engage in publishing in open access journals if we get funding, but in the questions and in what they take for evaluation, they never take into account any attitude towards open science and sharing and collaborative things, except the call is collaborative projects only, but that's it. So I wonder whether maybe the French agency is not a good example, but whether within Science Europe, you have examples of funding agencies more advanced in that change in evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I will not take for the French system, but I know examples in Science Europe. Also, a lot of Scandinavians they experiment, and there is a famous example. I don't say now. I don't want to judge. You know, for it, certain things work for certain countries and certain things for not other countries. But I know that 2 years ago, I think the Dutch government and the Dutch research funding agencies, they included, after a consultation with the society, they adjusted their research agendas. So 20–30% of their current research plan is also constructed via input from society. So this is some, you know, as an example. Then I know that other countries, it's not official, but some experiment now with peer review. Even thinking about the lottery system, because they know that at a certain moment that 10% the top are judgeable, and then there is a kind of a gray zone. So they even think about having to be more fair and to prevent bias, that even supposed to do a lottery. So yes, there are a lot of open sciences experiments, but they are in the same boat like everybody. At the moment, nobody knows what is the ideal. How would be the best way to go? The only thing which I can say is, if you want to have the plan as a reality, then you have to think of a reward incentive system, and it has to change. And the advantage of Science Europe is then that since it is a collaborative platform, that other agencies or organizations learn from each other. So, you know, best practices are exchanged. As I said, not necessarily, it depends also on the size of a country and the culture. And it's not about either to mainstream everything, but the beauty is also that you can learn from the experiment of others. And yeah, and some countries will even go slower and more rapid than the others. So.
Last question?
Yeah, you mentioned that, I'm here in the front.
Okay.
You mentioned that one of the goals of Plan S was to stimulate new innovative ways of publishing. And I wonder if you want to say more about the ideas you have for that and how Plan S will get us there.
No, I mean, no. What I can say, or what is common knowledge, is it's in 10 principles and what has been already published, and also the consultation now, which I don't know if you have seen the slides. We had about now already 650 feedback, and I think we will have about 1,000. So we have to examine it. But it's not Science Europe. It will be this coalition made up of the 12 members. So but in fairness, I think this manual or this guide will be probably revised, and then will be published, and then it's up also to the national level to implement it. And Science Europe cannot tell our members how to implement it, and as and mainstream we can give some advice. But that's the only thing I can say, because I'm neither an expert in new business plans, nor I'm directly involved in it. So, but in fairness, everything everything is published open. And the consultation will be, you know, you can contribute to it, and you can talk to your funding agency and make your voice heard. Because often what also happens is sometimes funding, you know, in your if you have close relationship to your or not, but sometimes staff from funding agencies, they are not always aware also what's going on in the community. So if they would know, they could also adjust certain things, especially in the peer review panels. But you need also feedback. You not always know what's why you were grumbling, you know, and you don't say nothing, and then, you know.
Okay, so I see the science is time. Let's thanks again our two amazing